Hey guys, tonight we step quietly onto a dusty street in a frontier town, and you ease your hand along a set of batwing doors that seem like they'll creak even before you touch them. The air is warm, the boards under your boots feel uneven, and the dry wind carries hints of horses, wood smoke, and something frying somewhere nearby. You're about to wander into an old Western saloon, one of those places where the food was far more important than the bar fights Hollywood likes to swear were happening all the time. In reality, you probably wouldn't survive one of those anyway, so let's stick to the food. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough right now, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you, because out here, time works differently, and nights stretch on in a way that makes everything feel a little softer at the edges. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push the saloon doors open, and the first thing you notice is how the inside feels surprisingly cool compared to the sun-scorched street behind you. It isn't air-conditioned, of course, just shaded, thick-walled, and designed by people who understood that comfort sometimes meant survival. You pause, letting your eyes adjust. There's a golden haze from oil lamps, and gentle murmurings of conversation drift across the room, almost like a sleepy blanket laid over the rough wooden furniture. You take a few steps inside, and the floorboards shift ever so slightly under your weight. They're not complaining, just welcoming you with old, familiar groans. You move in that slow, half-dreamy walk you use at home when you're sneaking to the kitchen at 2 a.m. for a snack you promise you're not going to regret. Except here, you're stepping into a place where snacks might be a bowl of cold-blooded cowboy beans or a slice of pan-fried salt pork cooked on a stove older than some of the bar patrons. The saloon isn't rowdy. Not yet. Maybe not ever, really. Contrary to the legends, most Wild West saloons weren't chaotic shootouts waiting to happen. They were more like community lounges, messy, loud sometimes, but more about food, drink, and tired people trying to feel human again after long days under a merciless sky. Historians still argue whether the stereotype of non-stop bar brawls came from dime novels, traveling storytellers, or a couple of truly unlucky towns where fights were entertainment. But here, in your quiet little saloon, it's all gentle chatter, soft clinks of tin cups, and a few card players who look like they've been staring at the same hand since breakfast. To your left, a piano sits with the lid up, but no one playing. You get the sense the pianist is on an extended break, possibly permanent. If you listen closely, the room gives off hints of vanilla from chewing tobacco, coffee grounds drying in the air, and the faint scent of yesterday's stew still living its best life somewhere nearby. You make your way toward the long, battered bar counter, running your fingers along its smooth but dented surface. The wood is worn from thousands of elbows and the occasional frustrated fist. Behind it sits a display of dusty bottles, some filled with whiskey, some with what you hope is whiskey, and at least one that looks suspiciously like old rainwater given a hopeful label. One quirky tidbit you might not expect: many saloons actually stretch their liquor by adding everything from brown sugar to chewing tobacco juice, and sometimes even cayenne pepper to give customers the illusion of strength. You will not be sampling that. Your stomach politely declines. The bartender nods at you, calm, unhurried, and gestures toward a few small tables near the far wall, where a couple of cowhands are finishing plates of something steaming. As you move closer, you notice the scent: warm broth, slow-cooked vegetables, and meat that's been simmering long enough to let even the toughest cut surrender. Frontier cooking wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Long stews were the backbone of saloon meals because they could stretch ingredients, mask the flavor of meat that had been, let's say, waiting for its moment, and keep warm all day without much attention. One mainstream fact you might already know is that saloons in many towns doubled as restaurants, offering regular meals long before the American diner was a thing. These spots served miners, cowboys, travelers, and anyone else who needed calories more than conversation. And calories were crucial. You didn't exactly have a desk job out here. Even holding your hat against the wind felt like a workout some days. A server passes by carrying a tray with something that looks like a pie, but definitely smells like onion, beef, and mystery. You watch as she sets it down in front of a mustached rancher who looks like he hasn't smiled since the invention of fences. He pokes the pie with his fork, nods approvingly, and digs in. The crust is uneven, a little lumpy, but golden in the most comforting way. Frontier pie crusts were sometimes made with lard, sometimes with tallow, and occasionally, when things were truly dire, with crushed crackers. Nothing was wasted, not even broken biscuits. You drift toward the kitchen door, where heat pours out in thick waves. A cook stands over a wide iron stove, lifting a lid just enough to let out a puff of steam. Inside is the stew you smelled earlier. Beans bubbling alongside chopped carrots, potatoes, and some kind of meat that, if you squint, could be anything from beef to rabbit. Another pot holds coffee so strong it could wake someone who wasn't even asleep yet. A third pot contains something creamy that might be grits or might be the cook's ongoing experiment. Historians still argue whether grits were as widespread in Western saloons as later nostalgia suggests, or if that's a Southern tradition people retroactively sprinkled across the entire West. You glance at the cook, who gives you a slow nod that feels like the Wild West version of "don't touch anything." You don't. Instead, you watch how carefully he stirs the pot, sniffing occasionally, adding a pinch of salt, and muttering under his breath like he's negotiating with the beans. Frontier cooks weren't fancy, but they were magicians with limited supplies. They had to be. On some days, they'd receive a wagon load of meat, flour, and produce. On others, they'd get a single onion and a prayer.
A cowboy at a nearby table slurps loudly from his bowl and says, "It tastes better than last night's." The cook pretends not to hear him, but definitely hears him. You sense this is a nightly ritual, a sleepy kind of banter that soaks into the beams and barrels of the place. You take a seat at a corner table where the candlelight flickers just enough to make your shadow sway lazily on the wall. Your boots lightly tap against the wood in rhythm with the low murmur of the room, almost like the saloon itself is breathing with you. You let your shoulders drop, settling into the atmosphere, becoming part of the slow western quiet. Outside, the wind slips under the door with a soft whisper, carrying dust but also a strange kind of peace. You look around the room, taking in the mix of travelers, locals, and drifters, all held together by the same simple desire, a warm meal and a place to stop moving. And here you are, easing into that same rhythm, letting the first flavors, scents, and scenes of the Wild West saloon world settle around you like a worn, familiar blanket. You ease deeper into the saloon, drawn almost unconsciously toward the warm heart of the place, the kitchen. It isn't exactly a separate room, so much as a corner claimed by whoever cooks well enough not to be questioned. The space is framed by a half wall and an open doorway, offering you fleeting glimpses of firelight, hanging pans, and the kind of concentrated chaos only one person seems allowed to control. You move slowly, letting your boots scuff softly along the planks, like you're sneaking toward the smell of cookies in your childhood home. But instead of cookies, it's steam rising off cast iron cookpots that look ready to feed half a territory. A soft plume of smoke wafts out, swirling lazily above the doorway, like it's decided to stretch before dispersing. You feel the temperature climb a few degrees with every step. There's something deeply comforting about that heat,
like standing in front of a campfire. Only instead of marshmallows, everything here smells like meat and onions. You take a breath, and the aroma settles into your chest with a warmth that makes you forget how long the frontier night outside can feel. You lean just close enough to glimpse the cook himself, a broad-shouldered man with rolled-up sleeves, hair greased back, possibly from actual grease, and an expression so focused it borders on spiritual. He doesn't notice you at first because he's mid-negotiation with a cookpot the size of a baby bathtub. Inside the pot, chunks of beef float lazily among diced carrots, onions, and a barrage of seasonings that seem to include salt, pepper, and whatever else he can scavenge from the shelves. Frontier cooking lacked precision, but made up for it with enthusiasm. You can practically hear the pot bubbling in slow, sleepy syllables, like it's trying to lull you into thinking you don't absolutely want a bowl right now. You shift your weight and accidentally let out a tiny floorboard squeak. The cook glances up, raising one eyebrow in a way that clearly says, "If you burn yourself, I'm not responsible." You nod politely, as though you've just agreed to sign a 27-page waiver. He turns back to the cookpots, lifting lids from each like he's checking on old friends. One pot holds a thick, nearly black brew that can only be Cowboy coffee, the kind strong enough to make your soul sit up straight. Another pot contains beans slowly surrendering to the heat, softened to a creamy texture that cowhands swear by. And in the corner sits a pan of sizzling salt pork, slowly crisping around the edges. The sound of the fat popping is oddly soothing, like distant rainfall or someone lightly tapping on a window. Frontier cooks knew that salt pork was both blessing and curse. It preserved well, lasted forever, and added flavor to almost anything. But after a few months of eating it daily, you'd start dreaming of lettuce. You watch him flip the pieces with a long fork, the kind that looks like it could double as a weapon if needed. He grunts in approval, then sprinkles something over the top. You can't tell what it is. Could be pepper, could be magic dust, but whatever it is, the scent that rises is heavenly. "Smells good," you say quietly. You're not trying to start a conversation. You're just acknowledging excellence. The cook snorts. "Smells better than it tasted last week," he replies, which you take as his version of a humble brag. You try not to smile, but one corner of your mouth betrays you. You step closer, still respecting the invisible line between allowed to look and about to get yelled at. You see shelves stacked with tin plates, mismatched bowls, and a few chipped mugs that have clearly lived dangerous lives. On one shelf sits something you didn't expect, a jar of dried herbs tied with twine. Frontier kitchens relied heavily on herbs, wild sage, parsley, even oregano, because they could mask the taste of meat that had matured beyond polite description. Now and then, a quirky tidbit pops into your mind. Some saloons actually flavor steamed their food with cigar smoke when firewood was scarce. You glance into the kitchen, half wondering if today is one of those days. Thankfully, the smoke here is just from the wood stove, curling lazily like a cat stretching after a nap. You listen to the faint clangs, the measured stirring, the low, rhythmic bubbling, sounds that feel almost hypnotic. If you could bottle this ambience and sell it as an ASMR track, you'd retire by tomorrow. Behind you, a few patrons shift in their chairs, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen door with that same hopeful expression you're wearing. Food was more than nourishment here, it was a nightly anchor. While alcohol had a reputation, meals were what kept people steady, grounded, and able to endure the relentless grind of frontier life. And here's a mainstream fact you might find surprising. Many of the most famous saloons made more money serving food than whiskey. Some even prided themselves on offering regular meals, which included everything from stews to fresh bread to slices of pie. Proof that the Old West wasn't just about drinking and gunfights, it was also about full bellies and comfort food. The cook slides a wooden ladle into the big stew pot, scoops up a hearty portion, and tastes it with the seriousness of a judge at a tiny frontier cooking contest. He nods once, adds a pinch of something else, and mutters, "Almost." You admire the dedication. The man is cooking for tired people who've ridden for miles, for travelers who've seen more dust than daylight, for workers who need a moment of warmth. Frontier cuisine is simple, yes, but the cook treats it with reverence. You lean your elbow gently on the half wall and watch the fire inside the stove flicker like a restless heartbeat. Historically, these stoves were miracles of iron, heavy, temperamental, and completely essential. And historians still argue whether frontier cooks preferred wood or buffalo chips when fuel ran short. Either way, the stove here seems content, radiating heat like it's doing exactly what it was born to do. A plate clatters behind the cook, and he turns to fry something new. This time, a handful of chopped vegetables thrown into a pan with sizzling flair. You catch a hint of garlic and wonder where on earth he found it. A supply wagon must have come through recently. He chops with swift, confident movements, the knife hitting the board in a rhythm that feels almost musical. Your stomach gives a gentle growl. Not embarrassing, just honest. You're not alone. A couple of patrons nearby shift, sniffing the air like hounds catching a scent. The cook ignores all of you. He's in his own world, where timing, fire, and flavor swirl into one slow, simmering dance. You feel a warmth settle across your shoulders, the kind that comes from standing near open flame and good food. It's cozy, grounding, the kind of feeling that turns a long day into a tolerable one. And somewhere in the haze of smoke and steam, you realize this. Saloon food wasn't just sustenance. It was the quiet heartbeat of frontier life, simmering steadily in open-fire cookpots that never truly slept.
You drift back into the main room of the saloon, letting the heat from the kitchen fall away as you return to the cooler, lamp-lit space where the evening unfolds in slow, measured breaths. You settle into a seat near a pair of cowhands who are hunched over their plates, shoveling food with the kind of determined focus only people who ride all day can manage. Their sleeves are dusty, their hats rest backwards on their chairs, and they look like they've been awake since the dawn of time.
This is where you really start to see what the everyday cowboy expected from a saloon menu, and what that menu said about life on the frontier. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fancy, but it was dependable, which for a world where storms, cattle drives, and occasional stampedes threatened your to-do list counted for a lot. Right away, you catch the sight of a familiar dish, a bowl of beans so thick the spoon almost stands upright. Cowboy beans, stewed long, slow, and seasoned with salt pork or bacon, were as essential as boots and coffee. You can tell these particular beans have been simmering since the afternoon, their edges soft and creamy, their flavor deepening with every sleepy bubble. One cowhand grunts in satisfaction, the kind of grunt that implies this is the first warm thing he's encountered all week. Cowboys didn't come to saloons expecting variety. They expected energy, fuel to keep them upright after hours in the saddle. A mainstream fact you might already know is that cowboys burned enormous amounts of calories each day. Riding wasn't just sitting. It was balancing, gripping, guiding, adjusting, lifting, managing ropes, and enduring the wind's best attempts to steal your hat. They needed food that stuck to their ribs and refused to let go. Beans, bread, meats, stews, these were their quiet allies. You lean back slightly and let the warm conversation wash over you. Someone mentions a recent cattle drive. Another complains about a saddle sore the size of a coin purse. Nobody brags about the food, not because it isn't good, but because it's exactly what they expect. Reliable, filling, uncomplicated. You glance toward a nearby table where a loaf of sourdough sits half-sliced. You can tell it's saloon-made. The crust is rugged, uneven, and possibly sharp enough to defend yourself with. Sourdough was the cowboy's bread, easy to maintain, nearly impossible to ruin, and capable of lasting through long journeys. The starter was practically a family member for some cooks, kept alive through careful feeding and whispered prayers. If it died, morale plummeted. You tear off a piece, noticing its chewy interior and slightly tangy scent. It's warm, the kind of warmth that makes your fingertips feel alive again. Dipping it into stew or beans was common practice, partly for flavor, partly for efficiency. Plates were optional. Bread was both utensil and ingredient. A cowhand across from you gestures toward a skillet where something is sizzling in shallow grease. He grins in your direction. Salt pork, best part of the day. You smile back. He's right. Salt pork, basically pork belly brined to within an inch of immortality, was a frontier staple. It traveled well, stayed edible long past what modern food safety inspectors would consider acceptable, and delivered enough fat and salt to make anything taste better. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some cowboys actually treated salt pork like currency, trading strips for favors, equipment repairs, or secrets about where to find decent water. If you had salt pork, you had bargaining power. You watch the cook bring out a platter of thin-cut beef. It's tough, almost comically tough, but the cowboys dig in with no hesitation. Meat wasn't always tender out here. Sometimes it came from older animals or cut so lean they fought back. But grilling or pan-searing them gave enough flavor to satisfy even the most exhausted riders. You pick up a piece of the beef, feeling its heat seep into your fingertips. The first bite is firm, chewy, but deeply savory. You can taste smoke, iron, and just enough salt to make your shoulders relax. You chew slowly, letting the texture tell its own story. A story of cattle drives, open plains, dusty trails, and long hours beneath an unrelenting sky. Behind you, a cowboy slams a cup down. "Coffee!" he shouts, not angrily, just dramatically. Cowboys treat their coffee with the same intensity some people reserve for sports rivalries. Coffee was life. Coffee was necessity. And saloon coffee was strong enough to qualify as a weapon. The bartender pours a fresh cup, steam spiraling upward in thin, ghost-like threads. You inhale the scent and feel your brain wake up despite your best efforts to stay sleepy. Frontier coffee was often boiled, sometimes repeatedly. Some cooks added eggshells to settle the grounds. Others tossed in crushed beans because subtlety was not the goal. Historians still argue whether cowboys truly liked their coffee this strong or if it was simply the best they could manage with inconsistent supplies. Either way, it worked. You sip it, carefully, very carefully. The flavor hits your tongue like a small, caffeinated punch. Your eyebrows lift, and you swear you feel your eyelashes vibrate. The cowboys nod approvingly, as if you've passed some sort of unspoken test. A quiet moment settles over the room. You hear the soft shuffle of cards from a nearby table, the clink of tin cutlery, and the gentle scrape of boots against the floor. You look down at your own plate, noticing how the simple ingredients, beans, bread, meat, blend into something remarkably comforting. The saloon isn't trying to impress you. It's trying to make sure you survive another day out here. A pair of travelers at the next table whisper about whether the saloon will have dessert tonight. One hopes for a sweet biscuit, maybe even a small fruit pie. The other laughs, saying, only if the supply wagon didn't get stuck in the river again. Out here, dessert was a luxury, not an expectation. But the hope itself was part of the experience. You glance again at the cowhands, who are now leaning back, hands on their stomachs, looking mildly victorious. A small debate breaks out, good-natured, quiet, about whether the beans today are better than the ones at a saloon down the road. They go back and forth, offering opinions with the seriousness of scholars discussing ancient philosophy. You catch the phrase, "Well, historians still argue whether," spoken by one cowboy mimicking a teacher he definitely didn't have. You laugh softly. So do the others. The room seems warmer now. Not physically, but emotionally. Food does that. It turns strangers into neighbors, at least for a while. As you sit there, chewing the last bite of bread and letting the flavors linger, you realize you're tasting more than ingredients. You're tasting routine, hard work, weariness, relief. All the quiet victories and quiet defeats that make up the life of a cowboy seeking nothing more than a hearty plate and a moment of rest. You stretch your legs beneath the table, your boots nudging the dusty floor. The lamplight flickers gently, casting soft shadows across the walls. The atmosphere settles around you like a comfortable coat, familiar, simple, steady. And in this small, warm pocket of the frontier night, surrounded by beans, bread, and the low hum of satisfied cowboys, you feel yourself slipping deeper into the world of Wild West saloons, one slow, steady bite at a time. You ease your chair back a few inches, stretching your legs while the saloon hums softly around you. The cowhands finish their plates, leaning back with that satisfied heaviness that comes after a long day and a warm meal. But as your gaze drifts toward the kitchen door again, something else catches your attention. A scent that doesn't quite match the beans, salt pork, or sourdough you've grown accustomed to. It's richer, earthier, almost wild. You straighten slightly. Ah, that smell, the iron-tinged woodsy fragrance, belongs to game meat. Tonight, the saloon has something special simmering. Cuts of wild game brought in by hunters who know the land far better than they know any menu. And this is where the frontier kitchen starts to reveal its unpredictable, improvisational side. Game wasn't just an occasional treat. It was a lifeline for many saloons. Supplies weren't guaranteed. Wagons got delayed. Traders vanished for weeks. And cows, despite being everywhere, were usually worth more alive than on a plate. So when a hunter strolled into town with a fresh haul, venison, rabbit, quail, sometimes even elk, the cook didn't just smile, he practically hugged the air. You rise from your seat, drawn once more toward the kitchen's glow. That earthy scent only grows stronger as you approach. The cook is back at his post, sleeves rolled even higher now, face flushed from heat and triumph. He lifts a heavy iron lid, releasing a cloud of steam that rolls over you like a warm, savory fog. Inside the pot are chunks of venison, their edges darkened from a pre-sear, their centers slowly softening in a broth tinted with herbs, onions, and something you suspect is a homemade attempt at wine. Emphasis on attempt. You watch the bubbles rise to the surface, slow and deliberate, like they're stretching before releasing their flavor into the stew. "Lucky day?" you ask with a sleepy smile. The cook snorts. Hunter came limping in at noon, said a deer practically offered itself to him. Don't buy it. You laugh softly. The idea of wildlife politely volunteering for the dinner menu feels unlikely. But then again, out here, stories take on lives of their own. A mainstream fact slips into your thoughts. Wild game was often the freshest meat saloons could serve. Beef and pork had to be transported or preserved, but venison or rabbit, that was delivered straight from the land, sometimes hours after being harvested. Hunters were valuable allies to saloons, and many earned free meals in exchange for regular deliveries. You lean against the half wall, watching as the cook ladles some of the broth into a tin cup, tasting it with an approving grunt. He adds a handful of chopped sage, rubbing it between his fingers first to release the oils, then sprinkling it like he's performing frontier sorcery. On the counter behind him sits a wooden crate lined with burlap. Inside lie a few plucked quails, their pale bodies arranged neatly, as if someone hoped presentation might help compensate for their tiny size. Quail was a delicacy when you could get it, often served roasted whole. Tiny as they were, they offered rich flavor, crispy skin, and a sense of luxury that made cowboys sit up straighter. One of the quirky tidbits you remember, some saloons advertised buffalo steaks, but historians still argue whether those were always legit or just thick cuts of beef renamed for dramatic flair. Actual buffalo meat existed, of course, especially earlier in the frontier days, but late in the West's history, buffalo were scarce, and deception was easier than admission. You watch now as the cook prepares a rabbit, already skinned and ready for the pan. He salts it generously, then dusts it with black pepper before lowering it into sizzling fat. The crackle is immediate, sharp, satisfying. The smell drifts outward, catching the attention of three gamblers who suddenly look away from their cards as if pulled by invisible strings. You trail your fingers along the warm wooden ledge as the cook works. His movements are rhythmic, practiced. Lift, turn, baste, taste. He's not just cooking, he's managing expectations, turning unpredictable ingredients into something consistently edible. He pauses, glancing over his shoulder to make sure you're not about to set anything on fire. Satisfied, he returns to the stove, grabbing a long-handled spoon to stir a second pot. This one contains a rich, dark gravy. Wild game always needed moisture. Venison especially had a reputation for toughness if cooked too quickly. Slow, low, patient heat was the only path to tenderness. You listen to the gentle bubbling, the kind that whispers promises of warmth and flavor. It's funny, game meat carries its own atmosphere. Beef smells like comfort, pork like tradition, but venison, rabbit, quail, they smell like the land, like the grasses, forests, and ridges the animals lived on. The scent isn't just food, it's geography simmering in a pot. A pair of cowboys step close to the kitchen entrance, doing unmistakably dramatic, deep inhales. One whispers, "That's deer, ain't it?" The cook doesn't even look up. "Ain't your deer?" The cowboys grin and slink back to their table. You suspect they'll get some eventually, but only when the cook is good and ready. You drift to the far side of the kitchen doorway where a small chalkboard hangs crookedly, listing tonight's options in barely legible handwriting. Someone has added "stew, ask what's in it" in big letters. That feels fair. Game stews were nightly surprises. A shadow moves near you, and you turn to see an older man leaning against a post, sharpening a small knife. His coat is worn, his boots muddied, and he carries the unmistakable aura of someone who knows every trail for miles. He notices your curious glance. "Hunter?" you ask gently. He nods once. "Got lucky today." You smile. The cook doesn't believe you. He gives a slow, tired grin, the kind that says he fully expected that. Cook never believes anyone, but he's happy to get the meat. You look at the venison simmering behind him, the steam rising in lazy swirls that soften the lamplight. He leans closer, lowering his voice. "Truth is, deer practically walked into me. Wind was right, quiet morning, felt like a gift." You nod, absorbing the softness of the moment. Out on the frontier, sometimes survival came down to timing, luck, or sheer stubbornness. He slips past you and into the saloon's main room, where he takes a seat near the fire. The cook plates the first serving of game stew a few moments later. Thick cuts of meat resting in a dark broth, potatoes and carrots glistening beneath the surface. He sets it on the pass-through, gives a sharp whistle, and a server whisks it away before the steam even begins to fade. You watch with quiet fascination. In this place, on this night, Wild game isn't just dinner, it's connection. To the land, to the hunters, to the seasons, to the unknown rhythms beyond the saloon walls. You take a step back, letting the smells envelop you like a warm, rustic blanket. Smoke, herbs, iron-rich broth, sizzling fat. It's grounding, almost meditative. The kind of cooking that reminds you food wasn't always wrapped in plastic and displayed neatly in grocery aisles. Sometimes it came straight from the world outside, raw, unpredictable, alive. And as you return to your seat, plate warming your hands, you realize this simple truth. In the Wild West, the tastiest meals were often the ones that wandered into town on four legs before becoming part of the saloon's sleepy, simmering rhythm. You wander deeper into the saloon, letting your fingertips glide along the scarred wood of a long communal table. The boards dip and rise like gentle waves, worn down by years of elbows, plates, dice, and the occasional fist, though you politely pretend you don't notice the dents shaped suspiciously like someone's forehead. Instead, you focus on the swirl of scents drifting from the kitchen. Warm dough, a hint of molasses, and that unmistakable dustiness of flour that somehow becomes comforting when you're already half sleepy. Tonight, you're setting into the world of saloon bread. Because out here in the frontier, bread isn't just bread, it's a lifeline. You slide onto a bench, and the table creaks under your weight, as if gently warning you that it has seen better days. A saloon cook sets down a pan of biscuits, each one round and slightly lumpy, the kind of imperfect that feels homemade rather than careless. These biscuits, you'll learn, are pure staples. In the Wild West, flour is almost an economy unto itself. You hear someone mutter that 100 pounds of the stuff is worth its weight in gossip. Slightly exaggerated, but honestly not by much. Mainstream fact incoming. Biscuits, cornbread, and sourdough were some of the most common breads served in frontier saloons, partly because they were quick to make and required ingredients that traveled well. Eggs, milk, and fancy spices, those were luxuries. Flour, water, a little lard, maybe a pinch of baking soda, that was more realistic for a saloon cook pushing through a busy evening. The biscuits in front of you steam softly, each little puff of heat rising into the dim air. You tear one open, and it flakes in that dense, satisfying way that frontier biscuits do. Not the tall, fluffy, golden layered things we get spoiled with today. These are sturdier, meant to sit in a saddlebag for hours. You smear on a bit of molasses butter, a rare treat here. You won't tell anyone, but you savor it in slow silence, pretending you're a mysterious stranger with a dramatic backstory. Then again, mild dramatic fantasies are allowed, as long as you don't actually try to pick a saloon duel. Given your track record with stubbed toes, you probably wouldn't survive that. Cornbread. The square is thick, with a crumb that leans slightly gritty but still tender. Cornbread traveled west with settlers who brought their traditions from the south, and in saloons, it became a universal comfort food. You can almost hear the cook telling you how cornmeal stayed fresh far longer than wheat flour, which explains why so many frontier meals leaned into it. The saloon's cornbread is baked in heavy cast iron pans, the kind that probably double as intruder deterrents if things ever get tense. This particular slice is warm, golden on top, and just the tiniest bit crisp at the edges. You take a bite, and the flavor is simple but grounding. It tastes like quiet, like survival, like someone trying their best with what they have. Just as you're settling into the rhythm of chewing and soft ambient people watching, a stranger nearby starts rambling about the saloon with the best bread in all the territories, claiming the recipe involved a secret ingredient, crushed grasshoppers. You pause mid-bite. He swears it gives the bread extra protein and crunch. You blink slowly, because that, you decide, is officially your quirky tidbit for tonight. While frontier cooks did sometimes use insects in emergency food situations, putting them in saloon bread wasn't exactly mainstream, but out here, you've learned never to say never. You glance back into the kitchen, where a sourdough pot bubbles gently on a back shelf. The starter has probably been alive longer than half the men at the bar. Frontier residents cherished sourdough because it didn't require purchased yeast. Just flour, water, thyme, and a bit of luck. California miners even called their starter Mother, which is sweet in an odd, slightly codependent way. The aroma of that sourdough, tangy, warm, complex, floats toward you, wrapping the room in a sense of continuity. Bread like this doesn't just feed stomachs, it feeds routines. Historians still argue whether frontier sourdough tasted more like modern San Francisco sourdough, or whether the wild yeast strains of the West gave it a completely different profile. You imagine two scholars in a heated debate, each dramatically waving a loaf of bread for emphasis. Meanwhile, you simply take another bite of your biscuit and decide that flavor debates are for people who aren't trying to stay awake long enough to taste the butter melting on their tongue. A server places a pan of flapjacks beside you. Yes, technically not bread, but in saloons they often counted. These flapjacks are hearty, browned unevenly, and smell faintly smoky from the fire. When you lift one with your fork, it droops slightly, the way all pioneer flapjacks did without modern fluffy magic. You drizzle a modest ribbon of syrup over them, savoring how it pools and glistens like amber. Someone at the bar jokes that flapjacks are for men who don't mind chewing, and you chuckle quietly because, honestly, these things could double as coasters if needed. A bread pudding sits nearby, and you raise an eyebrow, surprised by the hint of luxury. Bread pudding was the frontier answer to waste. When biscuits went stale and cornbread crumbled into dust, clever cooks soaked them with milk, eggs, if they had any, and a touch of sugar or dried fruit. Occasionally, a saloon splurged on raisins, which were like edible money in the West. The pudding in front of you has raisins, 3 whole ones. The cook must like you. As you eat, you shift your shoulders and notice how warm the place feels. Saloons weren't always cozy. Some were drafty wooden boxes. But a busy night meant enough bodies packed together to soften even the coldest spaces. Every so often, the swinging doors clack open, letting in a burst of night air, a swirl of dust, and someone loudly complaining about the price of flour. You sip your drink and let the warmth sink deeper into your bones. You reach for another biscuit, and your fingers instinctively follow the ritual. Break it, sniff it, butter it, breathe in the steam. There's something peaceful about the repetition, the way bread became a constant amid the chaos of frontier life. Whether miners stumbled in after long days or ranch hands sought a meal before sleep, bread was always there, simple, steady, quiet. Kinda like you on your more introverted days. A hushed conversation at the next table catches your ear. 2 men debate whether a nearby town really baked sourdough loaves so massive that a single one could feed an entire wagon party. One claims the loaves were 3 feet wide. The other claims 5, insisting you could actually sit on them. Both seem confident, and you let their voices fade into a soft background droning as you imagine a saloon cook rolling out bread dough the size of a bedsheet. Spoiler, that debate is unlikely to end tonight. You take your last bite of cornbread, the crumbs soft against your fingertips. The saloon lighting dims slightly, lanterns flickering as if joining you in a collective, slow exhale. Long tables grow quieter. The biscuits cool, the flapjacks rest, and even the sourdough pot bubbles more lazily, as though sensing the settling mood of the room. And you, full, warm, comfortable, lean back and breathe in the faint sweetness of cooling dough. Out here on the frontier, bread wasn't glamorous, but it was the quiet hero of the saloon world. Not as flashy as steaks, not as brag-worthy as whiskey, but dependable in its calm, grounding way. Exactly the sort of thing you needed tonight. You ease away from the long wooden table, brushing crumbs from your fingers, and drift toward the warm clatter of the saloon kitchen. The flap of canvas that separates the main room from the cooking space sways slightly with each step, letting out tiny puffs of steam and the unmistakable aroma of something rich and bubbling. When you slip through the opening, you find yourself in the thick, delightful chaos of frontier cooking, pots simmering, pans sizzling, and one very determined cook aggressively shooing a cat away from the meat shelf. You and the cat exchange a sympathetic glance. Neither of you is winning arguments in this kitchen tonight. You take in the scene with slow breaths, letting the mingling scents of stew, onions, pepper, and wood smoke settle over you like a warm blanket. Out here, saloon stews are the backbone of the menu. Cheap, filling, and forgiving when ingredients are less than glamorous. You peer into a heavy iron pot and find something that looks like stew, smells like stew, and probably qualifies as stew, even if no one can identify every ingredient floating in it. This is the Wild West, after all. Things happen. The cook hands you a tin spoon, and you lean over the pot. Thick gravy bubbles around chunks of beef, carrots, onions, and what appears to be a very confused potato trying its best to stay firm. Mainstream historical fact time. Beef stews, mutton stews, and even buffalo stews were staples of frontier saloons, largely because tough cuts of meat could be simmered for hours until tender. Long cooking also hid a multitude of sins, including meat that was, shall we say, aggressively aged. Refrigeration wasn't really a thing, and saloon cooks had to work with whatever the latest supply wagon delivered, or whatever was wandering past at the time. You scoop a spoonful into your mouth, and warmth spills through you instantly. The flavor is rich, salty, and comforting, like someone slow-cooked hope into the pot. A hint of pepper bites at the edge of your tongue. The broth is velvety and thick, almost sticky. The kind of stew that clings to the spoon like it doesn't want to let go. You make an appreciative hum, and the cook nods smugly, as if he personally reinvented the concept of boiling meat. A pan of chili simmers nearby. Frontier chili is an intense creature. Beans weren't always included, depending on the region, and sometimes dried chiles were so spicy you could practically hear a warning bell in the distance. The cook ladles some into a bowl for you, and you take a cautious sip. Instantly, your eyes water, but in a pleasant, I feel awake in a dreamy way. Chili became popular in saloons because dried chiles traveled well, and they masked questionable meat surprisingly effectively. You wipe your nose and pretend you're totally unfazed. The cook is absolutely not fooled. Then comes the quirky tidbit of the hour. The cook proudly tells you that some saloons added finely chopped rattlesnake to their stews, claiming it tasted just like chicken with personality. You pause, spoon hovering mid-air. Rattlesnake meat was indeed eaten on the frontier, but the idea of casually tossing it into saloon stew is bold. You give a nod that says, "I respect your commitment to story time, sir," and decide maybe you're full for the moment. You take a few steps toward a large pot nestled in the corner, its lid rattling slightly. A savory aroma, thicker, deeper, drifts up. This pot holds the good stuff, slow-cooked beef and beans, somewhere between stew and chili, the kind of meal that sticks with you for hours, soaking into your bones. As you savor the steam, someone at a nearby prep table mutters about the debate, that ongoing argument that saloon stews were actually recycled endlessly, day after day. Historians still argue whether some saloons truly operated perpetual stew pots, adding new ingredients daily without ever completely emptying the cauldron. The idea isn't impossible. Some medieval taverns did it, and it would have made sense in places where nothing was wasted. You picture a stew with a lineage older than most of the bar patrons and decide, maybe don't dwell on it too long. The cook moves to the back shelf and pulls down a jar of dried herbs. Frontier spice blends weren't exactly gourmet, but a little dried sage or chili powder could elevate even the toughest cut of meat. You watch as he pinches in a bit of salt, then a little more salt, then significantly more salt. Saloons were liberal with seasoning because salt preserved food, and also because taste buds on the frontier were harder to offend. You joke quietly that he should save some for the next century, and he stares at you with the weary eyes of someone who has heard every wisecrack since 1863.
A server brings you a bowl of Cowboy stew, a loose, stew-like mixture of beans, beef scraps, onions, and whatever else didn't escape the kitchen that day. You dip your spoon in and find that the flavors, well rustic, blend together beautifully. There's a smoky undertone, likely from the wood-burning stove. You can almost hear the hiss of burning logs beneath the steady bubble of broth, the fire providing both heat and rhythm.
Behind you, the cat returns to the meat shelf, clearly hoping you'll run interference. You offer a silent distraction by knocking lightly on a pot lid, causing the cook to whirl around. The cat snatches a small scrap of something and vanishes like a furry outlaw. You grin. Hey, everyone deserves a win. You turn back to your stew bowl, rolling a piece of tender beef between your teeth. It practically melts, the kind of melt that makes you consider writing poetry about broth. The steam curls into the air in soft spirals, each one drifting toward the ceiling as though carrying tiny messages of encouragement. The cook tells you that when buffalo hunting was more common, saloons often served buffalo stew, rich, hearty, and slightly sweeter than beef. But as buffalo herds diminished, these dishes became rarer. You nod thoughtfully, spoon hovering, imagining a table full of cowboys arguing over whether buffalo or beef made the better stew. One would brag that buffalo was the real frontier flavor. Another would insist beef was more reliable. A third would probably just fall asleep on the table mid-sentence. You respect that third guy. He gets it. A pot of venison stew catches your attention next. Not every saloon had it, but wherever hunting was plentiful, venison became a prized addition. This stew is darker, earthier, rich with the scent of onions and peppercorn. You take a bite, and the meat is tender with a faint gamey edge that feels authentic, like the forest shrubs decided to send you a postcard. The room grows warmer, cozier as you try each dish. One spoonful at a time, the flavors settle into you like memories. Maybe that's why stews were beloved. They weren't fancy, but they felt like coming home to something steady. Your eyelids grow heavier, not from the heat of the chili or the weight of the meal, but from the soothing repetition of spoon to bowl, bowl to mouth. Frontier food has a way of slowing you down, grounding you, making you notice small details. The soft scrape of metal spoons, the low murmur of kitchen voices, the gentle shifting of the stove as wood settles. Even the clatter seems muffled, like it knows you're winding down. You take one last sip of broth, letting it warm your throat. A dish towel flaps lazily on a nearby hook. Steam fogs a window pane. Someone hums an absent-minded tune. Everything feels soft, slow, and steady. Frontier stews might not have been glamorous, but each one was a tiny act of comfort, a warm pause in a world full of dust and unpredictability. And now, wrapped in the kitchen's glow, you find yourself sinking gently into that same quiet comfort. You slip back into the main saloon, your steps slow and softened by the lingering warmth of stew still settling pleasantly in your stomach. The evening feels deeper now, the lanterns dimmer, the shadows longer and lazier as they stretch across the floorboards. You drift toward the bar again, but this time you angle yourself toward a quieter corner, where a row of small plates is laid out. Simple, humble sides that never got the glory of the big saloon meals. And yet, these were the flavors that rounded everything out. the ones that made a dusty day feel just a little more bearable. A server nods to you and gestures toward the first dish, a bowl of beans. Just beans. You pick up a spoon and examine them. Soft, brownish, gently glistening with a bit of leftover cooking juice. Beans were everywhere on the frontier. They were cheap, filling, easy to store, and nearly impossible to ruin unless you actively tried. Mainstream historical fact, pinto beans and salt pork was practically the unofficial meal of the American West. Cowhands, miners, and saloon goers all lived on them. You scoop a bite and find the flavor familiar, earthy, straightforward, just a whisper of onion. Not exciting, but grounding, like edible background music. You take another slow bite and notice a thin curl of steam rising from the bowl, twisting toward the lantern glow. Someone behind the counter jokes that the saloon sells 3 kinds of beans: hot beans, cold beans, and yesterday's beans. You chuckle into your spoon. That makes joke number 1. The frontier loved beans, but not enough to invent a 4th option, apparently. Next to the beans sits a plate of potatoes, mashed into a lump that looks like it survived a minor bar fight. You drag your fork through the mound and taste a buttery, slightly peppery richness. This one is smoother than you expect, maybe because the cook used evaporated milk instead of fresh. Milk was a luxury in many towns, disappearing fast without refrigeration. Sometimes it traveled in cans, thick and sweet. Other times, mashed potatoes came out dry enough to qualify as construction material. Tonight's version is soft, warm, and surprisingly soothing. You let it coat your tongue as you lean back, letting the comfort of starch and heat do its slow work. You glance around. A few tables away, 2 men argue over whether a potato can be considered a proper meal all by itself. Historians still argue whether frontier saloons ever charged extra for the fanciest version of mashed potatoes, those sprinkled with parsley, which was basically edible emeralds out here. You imagine scholars passionately debating potato garnishes with deadly seriousness and shake your head softly. If only all academic disagreements smelled this buttery. Beside the mashed potatoes is a skillet of roasted root vegetables, carrots, turnips, and parsnips. You spear a carrot and bite gently. The flavor is sweet, slightly smoky from the fire. Root vegetables were a frontier cook's best friends. They stored well through winter, grew easily in tough soil, and held up to long wagon journeys. You picture a farmer pulling up a turnip with the sort of triumphant confidence most people reserve for treasure hunting. One carrot is misshapen, resembling something between a boot and a small dog. You decide not to question it. Frontier produce had personality, and that's part of the charm. As you savor the vegetables, the saloon cat slinks by, clearly already plotting its next food heist. It stops, sniffs at your carrots, and looks offended, positively offended that you are eating something without meat. You shrug apologetically. The cat flicks its tail, disappointed in your life choices, and moves on. You reach for a small dish of pickles. Not fancy pickles, frontier pickles. These things could probably survive a nuclear event. Vinegar brine was essential in the West for preserving vegetables long after fresh produce disappeared from markets. You bite into one, and the tang hits you like a polite slap. Strong, sharp, deliciously sour. Perfect for cutting through the heaviness of stews and potatoes. Some saloons made them incredibly salty to encourage customers to buy more drinks. A clever trick, slightly sneaky, but also effective. You make a mental note not to drink too much water too quickly, or you'll hear your stomach slosh like a canteen. A nearby plate holds something unexpected: corn fritters. They're unevenly shaped, fried to a crisp golden brown, and smell faintly sweet. You take a bite, and warmth spreads instantly across your tongue. Crispy edges, soft center, tiny bursts of corn. These were frontier treats, made when cooks had leftover cornmeal batter or a particularly abundant harvest. They weren't guaranteed on the menu, but when they appeared, they made the room feel just a little more festive. You close your eyes and appreciate that soft crackle as you chew. Then you hear it, the quirky tidbit waiting around the corner. A card dealer leans over to tell you that some saloon cooks used crushed soda crackers as filler for half their side dishes. Mashed potatoes? Crackers. Corn fritters? Crackers. Stuffing? Definitely crackers. According to him, crackers were the duct tape of frontier cuisine. You try not to laugh mid-bite, imagining a world held together entirely by crackers. Honestly, plausible. You notice a small loaf of brown bread sitting at the end of the table. Not the fluffy biscuits from earlier, but a darker, denser loaf filled with oats and molasses. Boston brown bread, someone calls it, an East Coast classic that migrated west with travelers who missed home. It was usually steamed, not baked, which gave it a moist, pudding-like texture. You slice off a piece, and the aroma of molasses drifts up like a warm memory. The bread tastes slightly sweet, soft, comforting, like a bedtime story disguised as food. You're not sure if it's historically perfect or just emotionally perfect, but either way, you savor it. Next to the bread is a dish of something white and creamy. You pause. Could it be? Yes, rice pudding, a rare treat. Rice traveled well, but wasn't as common as beans or potatoes, so when saloons offered rice pudding, people noticed. This one is thick, sweetened with a hint of cinnamon and dotted with raisins. You take a small spoonful and let it melt slowly across your tongue. It's gentle, soothing, warm, like edible lullaby music. You swallow and your whole body loosens just a bit. You rest your elbow on the table and tilt your head back slightly. The saloon buzzes around you with soft clinks of dishes, murmurs of conversation, the occasional cough from a cowboy who definitely ate his chili too fast. You let the sounds blend into a soft hum. These side dishes, humble, unassuming, were the flavors that grounded frontier life. Whether someone ordered a full meal or just needed something cheap to keep them going, these plates filled stomachs and quieted worries. A miner at the next table pokes his fork at his beans and jokes. If beans built the West, then potatoes wrote all the laws. You chuckle. Joke number 2 tonight. Another man claims he once ate nothing but beans for a month and swears he achieved enlightenment. You smile again. Joke number 3 checked off. And honestly, with the way your eyelids are drooping now, maybe bean meditation is a real thing. Your gaze drifts across the room, catching the gentle sway of lantern light against the wooden walls. Everything feels warmer, quieter. The food settles into you like soft sand filling a shape, smoothing out the rough edges of wakefulness. You take one last nibble of brown bread, feeling its sweetness anchor you to the present moment. These quiet, unremarkable side dishes were the steady heartbeat of saloon life. Simple, hearty, comforting. Just like this slow moment you're resting inside now, letting the world soften around you. You rise slowly from the table, brushing stray crumbs from your lap as the saloon's warmth settles deeper into your bones. The room hums with low conversation and the soft crackle of lantern wicks, and you follow the drift of sound toward another corner of the building, one where the kitchen doors swing a little more frequently and where the air smells unmistakably of something frying. Freshly fried, comfortingly fried, possibly fried within an inch of its life. Welcome to frontier dessert territory. You slip between 2 tables and approach a counter where an assortment of sweet, or sweet-ish treats waits for anyone craving a softer ending to their meal. Desserts in Wild West saloons weren't always guaranteed. Ingredients were scarce, ovens temperamental, and sugar expensive. But when a saloon did produce something sugary, even if it was slightly lopsided or vaguely burnt, people treated it like edible gold. Tonight, the cook seems proud enough to allow you a long, slow tour of the dessert spread. You start with something simple, a tin of molasses cookies. You pick one up, feeling its weight, slightly dense, a little chewy, the kind of cookie that doesn't snap so much as politely bend. You bite into it, and the taste of molasses rolls across your tongue, dark, rich, and warm with a hint of spice. Mainstream historical fact: molasses was one of the most common sweeteners in the West because it traveled well and was far cheaper than refined sugar. Refined sugar was for wealthy families, fancy hotels, or gamblers who won very big and wanted to show off. Most saloon sweets relied on molasses to get the job done. The cookie melts slowly in your mouth, its warmth settling into your chest. A nearby card dealer eyes the tin with longing, clearly waiting for you to step away before he raids the supply. You smile and leave him one extra on purpose. Beside the cookies sits a loaf of cornmeal cake, sometimes called Johnny cake, sometimes cornbread cake, sometimes whatever the cook managed today. You slice into it, releasing a waft of warm steam that smells faintly sweet and buttery. The texture is somewhere between cake and bread, tender but sturdy, like it has places to be and deadlines to meet. You take a bite, and the flavor is simple but satisfying. Slight sweetness from the molasses, grain from the cornmeal, a gentle crunch at the edges where it caramelized in the pan. A miner at the counter leans in conspiratorially and whispers that some frontier cooks secretly mixed leftover whiskey into their cakes to make them rise higher. You raise an eyebrow. He nods vigorously, sloshing some liquid from his own cup. There's your quirky tidbit for this section: whiskey cake. You're not sure if the science checks out, but the enthusiasm certainly does. You move on to a row of small plates holding what can only be described as rustic fruit concoctions. First up, dried apple pie. You slice into it gently, the crust crackling softly under your knife. Dried apples weren't glamorous, but they lasted through the winter and rehydrated nicely when simmered with water and a bit of sugar, assuming the cook had sugar and hadn't used it all on their secret whiskey cake experiments. You lift a forkful to your mouth. The filling is warm, slightly tangy, and sweet in a mellow, slow-building way. The crust, though imperfect, tastes like flour, fat, and effort, a combination you've come to appreciate tonight. As you chew, you imagine travelers entering the saloon after long days, seeing this humble pie on the counter, and feeling a small spark of home. You glance over to the next dessert, a pan of something golden and lumpy. Cobbler. Peach cobbler specifically, though these peaches definitely came from a can. Canned fruit was a luxury, but unattainable one, and saloons occasionally splurged when they knew someone important, or someone rich, was in town. You spoon a bit of cobbler into a bowl. The topping is soft and buttery, baked just long enough to hold itself together. The peaches beneath are syrupy and warm, practically glowing under the lantern light. You take a bite and let the sweetness unfold, slow and syrup heavy. It's the kind of flavor that makes your shoulders soften without your permission. Historians still argue whether saloons regularly sold fruit pies or whether such desserts appeared only in wealthy or well-stocked establishments. You picture two scholars passionately debating the distribution of canned peaches in 1880, and you smile. You take another bite. The cobbler answers the debate for you. It tastes too good to be rare. Then your gaze lands on something that looks suspiciously like a pile of slightly burnt dough balls. The cook approaches, arms crossed proudly, insisting these are frontier donuts. You raise one to your nose. It smells adventurous. The cook tells you they're fried in leftover bacon fat, which explains the smoky undertone. You bite into one and find it chewy, greasy, and weirdly charming. It's a dessert that knows exactly who it is and refuses to apologize. You set the donut down and examine the next treat on the counter, a small jar of what looks like custard. Not a fancy custard, more like simple egg and milk pudding. Thick, pale, speckled with nutmeg. You take a spoonful. The texture is smooth and soothing, the flavor mild but comforting. You close your eyes as it melts across your tongue. This is dessert for people who had rough days, for folks who needed something quiet and gentle before heading back out to a world full of dust and uncertainty. A small plate of fritters catches your attention next. Apple fritters, deep fried and dusted lightly with powdered sugar. The sugar coating is uneven because sugar was rationed carefully. You take a bite, and the fritter crunches softly before giving way to warm, tender apple. It tastes like fall, like bonfires, like the warm glow of a saloon window seen from a cold street outside. And now, joke number 1 for this section arrives in the form of a man at the bar loudly bragging that he once ate an entire pie by himself and achieved spiritual clarity. You nearly choke on your fritter. He insists the pie was a religious experience, which, judging by the sugar scarcity, might indeed qualify as a miracle. Joke number 2 comes moments later when another man claims that cobbler is basically a salad because it contains fruit. Nutritional science has officially left the building. Joke number 3 arrives as a cowboy demands to know why the donuts don't have holes. And the cook replies dryly, because these donuts are shy. You savor one last bite of your molasses cookie, letting its soft sweetness linger on your tongue as the saloon around you gradually softens into late-night stillness. The lanterns flicker lower, the kitchen clatter dies down. The air cools just a bit, as if settling alongside you. These desserts, humble, hearty, improvised, were the small comforts of frontier life. Not extravagant, not polished, but filled with warmth and resourcefulness. Every sweet bite you've taken tonight whispers the same message. People always find a way to make life a little softer. You sit quietly, hands folded around your warm bowl of pudding, and let that softness settle deeper into you. You ease back from the heat of the cook fire, rubbing your hands together as if brushing away the ghost of imagined grease. The sun has slid lower behind the rooftops, leaving long shadows, and the faint jingle of distant spurs drifts toward you like someone lightly shaking a pouch of coins. You follow the sound because, well, you're nosy in a relaxed, bedtime-appropriate way, and also because something smells different. Less like stew and more like sweet corn, toasted and buttery, drifting in a lazy ribbon through the cooling evening air. You round a corner, and there it is, a little wooden stand leaning slightly to the left, like it never quite recovered from someone bumping into it with a horse. A hand-painted sign reads in lopsided lettering, "Hot corn, fresh roasted, 5 cents." You take a moment to appreciate that the sign's artistic style could be best described as enthusiastically rushed, probably because the seller realized corn smells amazing when roasted and figured people would buy it even if the sign looked like a child's first attempt at calligraphy. You step closer, and the vendor gives you one of those nods, half greeting, half acknowledgement that you probably don't have a better dinner option. He twirls that ear of corn over a small brazier, rotating it with the kind of casual mastery that only comes from having absolutely no backup plan in life except selling corn until the world ends. He hands it to you wrapped in a scrap of paper, the kernels glistening with melted butter. When you take your first cautious bite, the warmth spreads through you like slipping into a freshly warmed blanket. Simple, comforting, and somehow exactly what your wandering stomach hoped for. A mainstream historical fact surfaces in your mind as you savor the corn. Roasted and boiled corn was one of the most common street foods in frontier towns, popular in mining camps, cattle stops, and even the rougher saloon districts. People loved it because it was cheap, filling, and required absolutely zero cutlery, ideal for a place where knives were usually used for, less culinary purposes. And here's a quirky tidbit that surprises you more than you want to admit. Some vendors didn't roast the corn at all. They simply sold it raw. Yup, completely raw corn on the cob. Apparently, enough folks enjoyed crunching into the vegetable equivalent of a firm memory foam pillow that the practice stuck around. You try to imagine someone walking down a dusty frontier street gnawing on raw corn like they're auditioning for an early ASMR channel, and you have to fight back a tiny snort. It's not very bedtime appropriate to laugh yourself awake, but the image is hard to shake. You wander on, still nibbling your corn, past a hitching post where two horses stand half asleep. One flicks an ear lazily as a fly buzzes by. Your boots thud softly against the ground, the rhythm lulling you deeper into the quiet comfort of the evening. As you continue, historians nudge into your thoughts with their eternal habit of debating things no one asked them to debate. Historians still argue whether street vendors in remote frontier towns sold corn seasonally or year-round, which somehow becomes a surprisingly big argument in certain academic circles. You picture two professors squaring off over an almanac like it's a high-stakes poker game, and you silently wish them well. Before the corn is even halfway gone, another smell joins the air. Warm, sweet, and slightly smoky. You turn your head toward the source like a prairie dog that just heard the dinner bell. Ahead of you, a woman stands by a simple table made from an old wagon plank, each board darkened from years of weather and the occasional accidental campfire incident. She's selling corn dodgers, little fried cornbread nuggets that frontier travelers adored, mostly because they could be eaten with one hand while the other held reins, tools, or a questionable life choice. She offers you one with a small smile. You accept, because frankly, you're not here to turn down carbs. The Dodger is warm and crisp, and when you bite into it, the texture is both gritty and soft. The cornmeal unapologetically rustic. You swear you can taste a hint of bacon fat, because on the frontier, everything involved bacon fat unless explicitly forbidden by law, which it wasn't, thankfully. You lean lightly against the wagon table, letting the evening breeze drift past, and enjoy that slow, grounding moment where the world feels simple. Food vendors bustle around you, someone setting out jars of candied nuts, another slicing apples, a kid selling tiny paper cones filled with sunflower seeds. For all the danger and chaos the Wild West is known for in pop culture, you're struck by how ordinary and almost cozy these food scenes really were. People needed to eat, needed comfort, needed small joys like roasted corn or hot cornbread. These quiet details get overshadowed by gunfights and outlaws, but this gentle bustle is what most days actually looked like. And because your brain wanders whenever you're well fed, you remember one more odd little detail. In some towns, vendors pushed corn roasters built into old wheelbarrows. They'd trundle them down the street, selling corn like some early version of a portable snack cart. Picture a frontier food truck, except it's a wheelbarrow filled with burning coals, and nobody had ever heard of fire safety regulations. You take a moment to respect the sheer bravery, or recklessness, historians still argue which, that made that idea seem perfectly fine at the time. Your corn finally dwindles down to the last few golden kernels, the paper wrapper now stained with buttery fingerprints. You toss the empty cob into a small barrel marked "Company Trash Only," which seems unnecessarily territorial for a container holding discarded vegetables, but you don't make the rules. You meander again, drifting as softly as the evening light settling over the town. The comforting fullness from the corn and the warm, crunchy cornbread sits pleasantly in your stomach, adding a drowsy heaviness to your limbs. You can almost hear your body say, "Yeah, we're doing great. Let's keep this slow stroll thing going."
A nearby cowboy blows out the lamp outside a bunkhouse, the little flame shrinking to a whisper before fading entirely. The smell of roasted corn and fried bread lingers in the air as night settles deeper, soft and steady. You let your shoulders drop, your steps loosen, your breathing slow. Something about simple frontier street food, humble yet comforting, seems to anchor you more than any fancy meal ever could. And with that ground and warmth inside you, you continue your steady walk down the dusty path, ready to slip into the next quiet corner of the Wild West food world.
You drift further down the dimly lit street, leaving behind the fragrant memory of roasted corn and hot cornbread, and find yourself drawn to a quieter corner of the town, where the saloon's back doors open onto a cobbled alley. The air here smells of smoke, leather, and a faintly metallic tang you can't quite place. It's the scent of a working town at dusk. Horses tied to posts, wagon wheels creaking gently, and the soft shuffle of boots across uneven stone. You follow the subtle sound of laughter and chatter, a low hum that feels like a lullaby in a world usually defined by tumbleweeds and sudden surprises. This corner belongs to a different category of frontier sustenance: snacks and small bites, the kind of fare that filled the gaps between meals or helped pass a long night in the saloon without committing to a full dinner. A small wooden cart leans against a wall, wheels worn smooth from years of rolling up and down these alleys. A woman stands behind it, a kerchief tied tightly around her hair, offering a warm smile that is half welcome, half, "You better not get in my way." The cart smells faintly sweet, faintly savory, and entirely irresistible. On it, there's an assortment of nuts, jerky, and what appears to be a bowl of candied pumpkin seeds. You pick up a handful of nuts and feel the warmth of roasted kernels under your fingers. Mainstream fact: roasted nuts, especially peanuts, walnuts, and hickory nuts, were common snacks in frontier towns. They traveled well, provided quick energy, and could survive months in a bag without turning rancid. Perfect for long rides, late-night card games, or simply for chewing thoughtfully while listening to someone argue over the latest gossip. You toss a few nuts into your mouth. The crunch is satisfying, almost meditative, and you chew slowly, letting the subtle flavors unfold. Earthy, faintly smoky, and just a touch oily. You notice a small group of cowhands nearby, trading jerky strips like currency. Jerky was another staple, preserved with salt and sometimes smoked over mesquite or oak. Tough, chewy, and intensely flavorful, it was ideal for people on the move or those too busy to cook. Some historians still argue whether jerky in frontier saloons was primarily beef, venison, or occasionally buffalo. Either way, you find yourself impressed by its portability and versatility. You nibble thoughtfully, imagining how many stories have passed over these exact strips of meat. A quirky tidbit presents itself in the form of candied pumpkin seeds. The woman insists these were considered a delicacy in certain frontier circles, often brought out when someone won a small pot at poker or claimed bragging rights over their horse. The seeds are sticky, sweet, and slightly chewy, the sugar glistening under the soft lantern light. You taste one, and it's an odd but delightful contrast to the earthy nuts and smoky jerky. It's one of those strange little culinary inventions that makes you wonder who first thought, yes, seeds plus sugar. Genius. You step away from the cart and notice a low bench against a wall where a few locals have spread out small wooden bowls. Inside are salted pretzels, coarse crackers, and tiny cakes shaped like coins. Hardly the elaborate pastries of the East Coast, but charmingly satisfying in their simplicity. Pretzels traveled well, especially for miners and cowhands, because their hard texture meant they could survive long journeys. They were a quick snack to tide someone over between meals. You pick up one of the hard pretzels, bite down, and the crunch reverberates faintly, mingling with the soft clink of coins on the nearby poker table. At the next bowl, a pile of coarse crackers waits patiently. Frontier cooks often baked crackers to last months at a time. They were dry, tough, and surprisingly versatile. You could eat them plain, dunk them in stew, or even crush them into a rudimentary pie crust if you got ambitious. You take a bite, noticing the subtle saltiness and grainy texture. It's not glamorous, but it's dependable. Somehow, that reliability feels comforting as you wander through the alley, your pace slowing, your senses softening. A small cart nearby is devoted entirely to sweets, candy made from sugar, molasses, and the occasional flavoring derived from fruits. These candies were rare and highly coveted. A simple piece could bring more joy than a full meal in the right hands. You take a small piece of molasses taffy and let it melt slowly in your mouth. Its warmth and stickiness feel indulgent, even if the ingredients are modest. Frontier children and adults alike treasure these little luxuries, the tiny sugar hit reminding them that even in tough, dusty times, small joys could be had. Someone near you tosses a small bag of roasted corn nuts into the air and catches it in their mouth, grinning. The snack is surprisingly spicy, seasoned with whatever powder the cook had handy, paprika, chili, or even a hint of dried herbs. It's a playful, lively snack, perfect for keeping energy up during a night of cards, conversation, or storytelling. You try one, and the heat is gentle, teasing your tongue without overwhelming it. You chuckle softly. In the midst of all the savory, earthy flavors, a touch of spice feels almost scandalously lively. You pause for a moment and notice the way the evening has softened around you. The lanterns flicker, the shadows sway lazily across walls, and the hum of distant conversation forms a kind of gentle background rhythm. Historians still argue whether frontier towns encouraged these snack stalls as social hubs, or if they simply appeared organically because people needed food at irregular hours. Either way, you appreciate the atmosphere, the tiny, intimate interactions, the shared enjoyment of something small and nourishing. By now, your hands are sticky with sugar from the taffy, your fingers dusted with cracker crumbs. The alley smells faintly of roasted nuts, burnt sugar, and warm bread from nearby kitchens. The simple act of eating, bit by bit, savoring each flavor, feels almost meditative. You notice the night has grown quiet, soft, as though the town itself has exhaled, letting the world slow down for you to catch your breath. Before you leave the alley, you grab a few more bits of jerky and nuts, tucking them carefully into your coat pocket. These are the snacks of survival and comfort, tiny reminders of the resourcefulness and creativity of frontier cooks. They sustain more than just the body. They sustain the small moments, the quiet conversations, the sense of continuity in an unpredictable world. You chew slowly, letting the flavors linger, feeling your body sink deeper into relaxation. Finally, you take one last look at the quiet alley, the carts, the soft glow of lanterns, the subtle bustle of people winding down. You step back onto the main street, your pocket full of snacks, your mind at ease. The simple, unassuming flavors of the frontier, nuts, jerky, pretzels, and candied seeds remain with you like a gentle lullaby, ready to settle you into the next layer of the Wild West food journey. You wander back toward the heart of the Saloon district, the soft creak of your boots blending with distant echoes of piano keys and quiet laughter. The evening has deepened, folding the streets into shadows that feel almost velvety. You pause near a cluster of buildings, their windows glowing warmly, and notice a subtle change in the scents around you. A heavier, richer aroma that speaks of fermented grains, aged fruits, and the faintly nutty smell of barrels resting quietly in cellars. This is the territory of frontier beverages, the drinks that accompanied meals, snacks, and late-night conversations. They weren't always fancy, and sometimes they were dangerously strong, but they had character and they had purpose. You drift toward a small wooden counter tucked just inside the corner of a saloon. The bartender, a sturdy man with a faintly stained apron, greets you with a nod that suggests both curiosity and mild caution. In front of him, bottles of various shapes and sizes glint of the lantern light, labels faded, some hand-painted, some scrawled in hasty ink. Mainstream historical fact: saloon beverages ranged widely, from locally brewed beers and ciders to whiskey and homemade cordials. Saloons often made their own house spirits or sourced them from nearby towns,
giving every drink a unique, sometimes unpredictable flavor.
You decide to start small and take a cup of ale from a wooden cask, its surface frothy and inviting. The liquid is smooth, slightly sweet, with a faint, earthy undertone from the grains used. You lift it slowly to your lips, letting the aroma drift first, warm and comforting, before tasting. The flavor spreads gently, warming your throat and chest in a steady, comforting way. Ale was a staple on the frontier because grains could be stored relatively easily. Brewing could be done in small batches, and alcohol, while potent, helped people stave off minor illnesses and boredom alike.
Next comes a curious little concoction: cider, fermented from locally available apples. It's tart, slightly effervescent, and hints at a sweetness that slips quickly away, leaving you with a clean, refreshing finish. Frontier cider was sometimes safer than water, which could carry unpredictable contaminants. Some towns even claimed their cider cured what ailed you, though historians still argue whether these claims had any real basis or were mostly clever marketing. You sip slowly, letting the tartness lift your spirits without jarring your calm.
A quirky tidbit emerges when the bartender shows you a small bottle of something labeled snake whiskey. Apparently, frontier distillers sometimes infused their spirits with rattlesnake or other reptiles. The intent was partly medicinal and partly showmanship. You peer at it warily, imagining the scent of snake floating faintly beneath the bourbon. It's both alarming and oddly fascinating. One of those frontier oddities that make you appreciate the creativity or desperation of the time. You take a careful sniff, deciding that maybe admiration from a distance is enough. The bartender slides a mug toward you next, filled with a frothy, amber-colored liquid you recognize as coffee. Frontier coffee was a necessity for long days, often brewed over hot coals in cast-iron pots. It was strong, dark, sometimes bitter, and occasionally dusted with a touch of sugar or cream when available. You take a sip, feeling the warmth travel down to your chest and settle in your stomach, complementing the slow, steady fullness from earlier meals. Coffee was more than a beverage. It was a gentle ritual, a way for cowhands, miners, and travelers to gather themselves, focus their energy, or simply pause and breathe. A small jug of tonic sits nearby. This is not the gin and tonic you might imagine, but a homemade mixture often containing herbs, sugar, and fermented liquids believed to invigorate or even cure minor ailments. Frontier medicine was unconventional at best. Historians still argue whether these tonics had any real efficacy or if their value was primarily psychological, offering comfort in uncertain circumstances. You take a tentative sip, finding it earthy, slightly sweet, and vaguely reminiscent of the countryside itself. The bartender leans back and casually mentions sarsaparilla, a popular beverage derived from the root of the smilax plant. Served sweetened and cold, or warm when necessary, it was considered both a treat and a mild restorative. You lift the mug, noticing the gentle aroma, sweet, woody, faintly vanilla-like. The first sip is smooth, slightly tangy, and surprisingly refreshing. Frontier sarsaparilla wasn't just a drink, it was a small ritual, a pause in a dusty, unpredictable day.
You glance around and notice a few locals enjoying their drinks in quiet companionship. One man carefully rolls a coin across the table. Another stirs his coffee absent-mindedly, while a third raises a glass to an empty chair. It strikes you that beverages, more than the food itself, shaped these social spaces. Ale, cider, and coffee became part of a rhythm, sipped slowly between stories, shared with friends, or held close during moments of reflective solitude. You take another slow sip, letting the warmth and mild sweetness ground you further.
The bartender quietly pours you a small glass of whiskey. Frontier whiskey was known for its potency, but it was also carefully crafted when possible, distilled in small batches to bring out the flavor of corn, rye, or barley. You inhale the rich, caramel-tinged aroma and take a tiny sip, feeling it settle warmly through your chest. Whiskey wasn't always safe, but it was comforting, a drink that reminded people, quite literally, of home and hearth. A quirky tidbit surfaces again. In some saloons, bartenders flavored their whiskey with unusual additions: juniper berries, dried fruits, or even hints of chili. The goal was to distinguish their house liquor from competitors. You try to imagine sipping something that tastes faintly of chili in the warm glow of a lantern, and it makes you smile. You might not order it again, but the creativity is undeniable. You lean back in your chair, allowing the evening's ambiance and the quiet rhythm of sips and murmurs to settle around you. The warmth of beverages, paired with the comfort of simple foods and snacks, forms a steady, almost meditative cadence. It's the unglamorous heartbeat of frontier life, a steady, grounding presence that, even in a world full of unpredictability, offers comfort. Before you leave the corner of the saloon, you take one last slow sip of your coffee-turned-ritual, letting its warmth linger on your tongue and in your chest. The soft murmur of conversation, the gentle clinking of mugs, and the faint tang of fermented spirits form a delicate lullaby. It's remarkable how something as simple as a drink can tie together so many aspects of daily life: sustenance, social connection, and quiet pleasure. You rise, feeling the gentle heaviness of warmth, nourishment, and calm spreading through your limbs. The night is soft around you, the lanterns flickering like tiny stars caught in the wooden frames of windows. You take one last look at the assortment of drinks, appreciating the resourcefulness and creativity that went into each cup, mug, and glass, before drifting slowly toward the next corner of the saloon for another layer of frontier culinary exploration. You move away from the warm glow of the bar and wander toward the quieter back rooms of the saloon, where shadows stretch longer and the faint creak of floorboards underfoot blends with the gentle hum of conversation. There's a peculiar stillness here, a slower rhythm, as if the hustle of drinks, meals, and snacks in the main room has been left behind. And yet, the aroma clings. Hints of smoked meat, roasted nuts, and just a whisper of molasses. This is the domain of pickled and preserved foods, those quietly heroic staples that sustained frontier towns when fresh ingredients ran scarce. You find yourself drawn to a small wooden shelf stacked with jars and crocks. Some are large, earthenware vessels sealed with cloth and string. Others are clear glass jars, their contents gleaming in the lantern light. Mainstream historical fact: pickling and preserving were essential skills on the frontier. Vegetables, fruits, and even meats could be saved for months, sometimes years, through pickling in brine or vinegar, sugar preservation, or smoking. Without these methods, settlers would have faced far more difficult winters, and saloons would have had less to offer during off-season months. You pull down a jar of pickled cucumbers and unscrew the lid carefully. The scent is tangy, sharp, and oddly reassuring. You bite into one and the crunch is immediate, the vinegar pleasantly biting at your tongue, but tempered by a hint of sugar and dill. These aren't the uniform, mass-produced pickles of the modern grocery store. They have personality, imperfections, and a certain defiance of symmetry. You savor each bite slowly, letting the tangy flavor linger. Nearby, a crock of preserved peaches sits partially covered with cloth. These peaches were canned or preserved with sugar, a small indulgence that sweetened the harsher months of the frontier. You spoon one into your mouth, the syrupy sweetness rolling over your tongue like liquid sunlight. Frontier preserves weren't always consistent. Sometimes the sugar caramelized, sometimes the fruit retained a faint bite. But each jar carried the comforting knowledge that food could last, that you could rely on it when the world outside the saloon seemed unpredictable. A quirky tidbit emerges from the next jar: pickled watermelon rind. You raise an eyebrow, but the bartender, or perhaps a curious patron, insists that it was popular in some areas, sweet and tangy, a clever way to use what might otherwise be discarded. You try a small piece and are surprised. It's crisp, lightly sweet, with a subtle vinegar bite. You imagine someone serving it proudly alongside a stew or a chunk of roasted meat, the oddity balanced perfectly by its practicality. The jars seem endless. Pickled beans, cabbage, carrots, even eggs tucked in brine. Each one is a small story of resourcefulness. Eggs were especially tricky. Without refrigeration, they had to be consumed quickly, preserved in lime or salt, or turned into pickled treats. You nibble at a pickled egg, finding it tart, soft, and oddly comforting. Historians still argue whether pickled eggs were mainly a snack for laborers or a clever trick by saloon owners to keep patrons drinking. Either way, the flavor settles quietly in your stomach, complementing the warmth from earlier stews and beverages. You drift toward a set of smoked meats hanging in the corner, strips of beef, pork, and occasionally venison. Smoking was a cornerstone of frontier preservation. The process infused the meat with flavor while keeping it edible for long periods. You slice a small piece and let it rest on your tongue. The smokiness is deep, earthy, slightly sweet, and carries a warmth that seeps slowly through your chest. It's the kind of flavor that makes you imagine crackling fires, long nights of storytelling, and the quiet companionship of people who understood that food was more than sustenance. It was survival. A small pile of dried fruits rests beside the smoked meats: apricots, apples, cherries. These were treasured not just for taste, but for nutrition. Fruit provided essential vitamins when fresh produce was scarce, and the drying process concentrated the flavors into a sweet, almost candy-like treat. You pop a dried cherry into your mouth, the tart sweetness awakening your senses in a gentle way. The flavors mingle with the pickles and smoked meats, creating a complex yet subtle symphony of preserved tastes. You take a step back and realize that all of this, pickled cucumbers, preserved peaches, smoked meats, dried fruits, represents months of effort and ingenuity. Someone out there in the kitchen or cellar had spent hours chopping, boiling, salting, and smoking, all to ensure that when a weary traveler entered the saloon, sustenance and comfort awaited. The thought is quietly humbling. Frontier life demanded practicality, creativity, and patience, and sometimes a willingness to taste something unusual just to survive. A curious patron offers you a taste of pickled onions. You hesitate only for a moment, then bite. Sharp, tangy, slightly sweet, the flavor hits your taste buds with a punch that wakes you up just enough to feel fully present. You nod politely, appreciating the ingenuity required to make such a strong flavor edible and enjoyable. Historians still argue whether frontier towns relied more heavily on pickled vegetables than fresh ones, or if the preserved foods were considered supplementary. Either way, the shelves before you make the debate feel almost irrelevant. The jars, crocks, and hanging meats tell the story themselves. People needed nourishment. They found ways to create it, and they shared it with anyone willing to partake. You wander slowly through this quiet back room, sampling from a jar here, a slice of smoked meat there, letting the flavors unfold on your tongue. The pickle's tang, the preserve's sweetness, the smoked meat's depth, they all mingle with the warmth still lingering from your beverages. The experience is grounding, steadying, and strangely soothing, like a gentle reminder that human ingenuity often hides in the simplest acts: preserving, storing, and sharing food. As you step back toward the main saloon floor, your stomach pleasantly full, you take one last bite of a pickled peach. The tart-sweet balance melts slowly across your tongue, leaving a soft warmth in its wake. You can feel the day's bustle fading, the room softening around you. The preserved foods, humble and steadfast, have offered more than nutrition. They've offered a connection to the rhythm of frontier life, a quiet nod to the care and forethought of those who came before. The evening air drifts gently through the open doors, carrying a whisper of dust and distant wood smoke. Your steps grow slower, heavier in the best way, as you leave the back room behind. You feel settled, warm, and ready to continue exploring the comforting layers of frontier cuisine, knowing that behind every bite lies a story of ingenuity, patience, and a touch of daring. You drift back into the saloon's main room, the warmth of lantern light and faint wood smoke wrapping around you like a soft blanket. The clatter of dishes, the gentle hum of conversation, and the low creak of floorboards underfoot create a slow, steady rhythm that feels almost like a heartbeat. Your steps guide you toward the side tables, where the quieter corners of the room hold spices and condiments, the subtle magic makers that transformed ordinary frontier meals into something memorable. It's easy to overlook these small elements, but on the frontier, a pinch of something exotic could elevate beans, potatoes, or roasted meats from merely filling to surprisingly comforting. You pause at a narrow shelf lined with small jars, bottles, and tin containers. Their labels are handwritten, faded, or sometimes missing entirely. Mainstream historical fact: frontier cooks relied heavily on a few essential spices: salt, black pepper, cinnamon, and dried herbs. But they also experimented whenever possible. Peppercorns were highly prized, cinnamon was a treat, and even small amounts of nutmeg or cloves could bring warmth to a stew, a dessert, or a simple bowl of beans. You lift a jar of dried sage and inhale its earthy aroma, feeling a subtle, grounding warmth spread through your chest. A small tin of dried chili flakes catches your attention next. You sprinkle a tiny pinch over a plate of roasted potatoes, just enough to awaken the flavors without overwhelming them. Frontier cooks often use chili and paprika sparingly, aware that too much heat could ruin a dish. But a careful hand could add depth, complexity, and just a whisper of daring. You taste the potato and nod. The warmth is subtle, teasing your tongue, adding a quiet excitement to an otherwise humble food. Historians still argue whether frontier towns had regular access to imported spices or whether most flavoring came from locally grown herbs. Either way, your taste buds are convinced. A quirky tidbit appears in the form of a small bottle of clove essence. The bartender explains that some saloon cooks added cloves to their molasses desserts, believing it enhanced the flavor, and sometimes they swore it even improved health. You raise an eyebrow, but decide to sprinkle a tiny amount onto a piece of molasses cake. The aroma rises, spicy and sweet, curling around your senses like a gentle whisper. You taste it, and the flavor is surprising, warm, rich, and comforting, almost like a tiny hug from the past. Nearby, a tin of coarse salt and a small bottle of vinegar sit side by side. Salt was invaluable on the frontier, essential not only for seasoning, but also for preserving meats and vegetables. Vinegar, often homemade, was equally versatile, pickling, flavoring, and occasionally disguising less than fresh ingredients. You imagine a cook carefully measuring both, mindful of every grain and drop, transforming humble beans or fried cornbread into something subtly enhanced. You sprinkle a tiny bit of salt onto a roasted carrot, then a few drops of vinegar over a slice of smoked meat. The flavors awaken gently, reminding you that small adjustments could make a lasting difference. You notice a jar of mustard seed tucked in the back. Frontier cooks ground these seeds into a coarse mustard paste for meats or mix them into sauces. You take a careful taste of a spoonful, and the heat hits slowly. A gentle burn that lingers just long enough to keep your attention without startling your senses. It's a quiet thrill, the kind that elevates simple food into a small adventure. A small pile of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, oregano, sits nearby. You crush a few leaves between your fingers, releasing the scent, earthy, pungent, and familiar. Frontier cooks often grew these herbs themselves, tucked into small gardens behind their buildings or in window boxes. Even in towns where space was limited, these tiny green warriors brought life and personality to otherwise simple meals. You imagine someone sprinkling thyme into a pot of beans, the aroma rising with the steam and reaching a table full of hungry cowhands. Another quirky tidbit emerges when a miner at the next table leans over to whisper that some cooks experimented with crushed coffee beans in savory dishes, believing it enhanced flavor and gave an energy boost. You can't help but chuckle at the image of beans, potatoes, and coffee mingling in one pot. Still, the practice was reportedly common enough to be remembered decades later. You consider trying it on a potato wedge, but decide to admire the idea from afar. A small bottle of vanilla extract sits almost shyly in the corner. Vanilla was rare and precious, usually reserved for desserts or celebratory meals. You add a few drops to a bowl of rice pudding, and the aroma immediately softens the room, curling around your senses like a whisper of comfort. Even on the frontier, small luxuries like vanilla could elevate food from sustenance to soothing indulgence. Historians still argue whether vanilla was commonly available in remote towns, or if it was considered a luxury so rare that most residents never tasted it. Either way, the sensory effect is undeniable. You shift your attention to a tiny jar of smoked paprika. Frontier cooks sometimes used smoked paprika to season meats, vegetables, or even simple stews. You sprinkle a bit over a slice of roasted meat and taste. The flavor is subtle but deep, earthy with a hint of smoke, enhancing the existing richness without overpowering it. You realize that the frontier's simple dishes often relied on such careful touches to make them memorable. As you continue exploring the array of spices and condiments, you realize that these small jars carry more than flavor. They carry creativity, foresight, and the kind of gentle experimentation that turned necessity into comfort. A pinch here, a drop there, and a humble plate of beans or a piece of cornbread transforms into something quietly remarkable. The low hum of conversation, punctuated by clinking glasses and soft laughter, blends with the aromas and tastes around you. You reach for a small jar of crushed red pepper and add a hint to a side of beans, enjoying the subtle tingle it brings to your tongue. You think about the cooks who spent hours grinding, measuring, and tasting, balancing flavors carefully without modern tools or standardized recipes. Their work feels intimate, thoughtful, and almost meditative. Before leaving, you take one last, slow, deep sniff of the shelf, a mixture of herbs, spices, vinegar, and sweet extracts. The scents mingle, creating a quiet symphony that feels like the essence of frontier cooking itself, resourceful, inventive, and surprisingly comforting. You step away from the shelf, your senses gently saturated with warmth and flavor, ready to continue wandering through the layered tapestry of Wild West culinary life. You move deeper into the saloon, letting your hands brush lightly over the worn wooden edges of tables and chairs, feeling the faint grooves left by decades of elbows, cups, and coins. The main room hums quietly tonight, the piano in the corner soft and tentative, as if easing itself into slumber along with the patrons. Your attention drifts to the corners where side dishes and accompaniments quietly await, the understated heroes of frontier meals. These were the foods that rarely earned applause, but elevated every main dish, filling out the plate with subtle textures and flavors. A small table against the wall holds bowls of beans, corn, and mashed vegetables. Mainstream historical fact: beans were a staple in frontier diets, cheap, nutritious, and versatile. They could be simmered slowly in a pot, flavored with whatever herbs or meat scraps were available, and served alongside nearly any meal. You lift a spoonful of black beans, warmed and tender, letting their earthy flavor coat your tongue. The seasoning is simple: salt, a pinch of pepper, maybe a hint of chili, but it's deeply satisfying. The slow, savory taste settles pleasantly in your chest, a quiet reminder that sustenance doesn't need flair to be comforting. Next to the beans is a pot of creamed corn, the kernels tender and gently sweet. You dip a spoon in, enjoying the smooth, slightly sticky texture as it drifts across your tongue. Corn, in its many forms, was everywhere on the frontier. Roasted, boiled, ground into meal, or simmered into a creamy dish like this one. You remember the roasted corn from earlier, but here the flavor is richer, softer, almost soothing. You can imagine tired cowhands returning from long days in the sun, spooning this warm, hearty dish onto their plates, feeling quietly restored. A quirky tidbit comes in the form of mashed potatoes enriched with a hint of onion and sometimes even a dash of coffee. You raise an eyebrow, curious, and taste a small scoop. The potato is creamy, smooth, and comforting, with an unexpected warmth from the coffee that lingers at the back of your palate. Apparently, some cooks experimented with coffee to deepen flavor, stretch ingredients, or simply add a hint of novelty to a humble dish. It's unusual, yes, but strangely delightful. Nearby, a small dish of sauerkraut sits quietly, the tangy aroma filling the air. Fermented cabbage was common because it lasted long and provided important vitamins, especially in winter. You take a gentle bite, the tang awakening your taste buds without overwhelming them. It pairs beautifully with the smoked meats and beans you've sampled before, creating a balance of richness, earthiness, and acidity. Historians still argue whether sauerkraut was a regular staple in all frontier towns or if it was mostly found in communities with European influence. Either way, it works seamlessly with the flavors around you. A bowl of simple pickled carrots and onions rests beside the sauerkraut, bright in color, tangy, and lightly sweet. You nibble a piece of carrot, the crunch firm but not harsh, the flavors subtly enhanced by the brine. These small accompaniments weren't glamorous, but they added texture, color, and flavor, elevating otherwise modest meals. You notice a tiny dish labeled apple butter, dark and glossy, its aroma warm and inviting. You spread a small spoonful onto a chunk of cornbread you retrieved from earlier. The sweetness is rich but not overpowering, with a gentle tang that complements the corn's natural flavor. Apple butter was made by slow-cooking apples with sugar and spices, a practice that transformed humble fruit into a velvety, aromatic spread. It's the kind of accompaniment that makes a modest slice of bread feel indulgent. A quirky tidbit arises when the bartender mentions that some frontier cooks mixed a bit of molasses into their apple butter, claiming it helped it last longer and added a secret kick. You taste a tiny dab, and the flavor indeed has a subtle, deep warmth, sweet, rich, and slightly smoky. You imagine someone spooning this over cornbread while leaning back after a long day, feeling the quiet comfort of something thoughtfully prepared. You drift toward a plate of pickled beets, deep crimson and glistening in the lantern light. The earthy sweetness mingles with vinegar tang, a combination both surprising and delightful. You nibble slowly, noticing how the pickling enhances the beet's natural flavor rather than masking it. These small touches, the pickles, preserves, and sauces, showcase the ingenuity of frontier cooks who transformed simple ingredients into something memorable. A small dish of fried onions sits nearby, golden and tender. You sprinkle a few atop a slice of mashed potato, and the sweetness of the onion melds perfectly with the creamy potato. You savor the combination, noting how these small additions, crispy, tangy, sweet, turn a basic plate into a layered, thoughtful meal. It's subtle magic, the kind that quietly impresses without demanding attention. You glance at a tiny bowl of lard, its creamy texture and faint aroma hinting at its role as both cooking medium and accompaniment. Frontier cooks used lard to fry, to enrich dough, or to provide a bit of richness to simple vegetables. You take a careful bite atop a small piece of bread, and the flavor is mild but deeply satisfying, the texture melting gently on your tongue. You appreciate the resourcefulness behind such an ingredient, a reminder that ingenuity often lies in simplicity. A touch of nostalgia washes over you as you reach for a small dish of stewed dried fruits, apricots, peaches, and cherries, softened through gentle simmering. The sweetness is mellow, balanced by a hint of tartness, and provides a lovely counterpoint to the saltier, earthier side dishes. You take a slow bite, letting the flavor linger, imagining how these tiny bowls brought moments of joy to weary travelers. Historians still debate whether these accompaniments were considered essential parts of a frontier meal or more like optional luxuries. From where you sit, tasting each bite, they feel essential, not in terms of survival perhaps, but in the quieter, subtler sense of comfort. They complete the meal, fill in the spaces, and offer texture, aroma, and gentle delight. As the evening progresses, the saloon's activity softens. Patrons lean back in chairs, conversation fades to murmurs, and the piano ceases its tentative playing. You lean lightly on the side table, savoring the final bites of beans, mashed potatoes, apple butter, and pickled accompaniments. The flavors mingle with the warmth of previous dishes, the comforting beverages, and the quiet atmosphere, creating a full, slow crescendo of sensory satisfaction. You step back, feeling the gentle weight of contentment settle over you. The side dishes and accompaniments, humble, ingenious, thoughtfully prepared, have carried you deeper into the rhythm of frontier life. They remind you that comfort often comes not from extravagance, but from care, creativity, and the quiet dedication of those who prepared food to sustain and soothe. You pause at the edge of the saloon, taking in the full scene. The flickering lanterns, the warm glow of the wooden walls, the faint hum of distant conversation blending with the soft shuffle of boots on the floor. The night has settled fully, and a calm hush seems to hover over the town, as if even the dust has paused to breathe. Your journey through the foods of the Wild West has brought you from hearty breakfasts and sizzling dinners to snacks, beverages, pickles, spices, and now, finally, desserts and final treats. The sweet notes that punctuated long, hard days and left lingering comfort well into the evening. A small table against the far wall is covered in simple desserts. Mainstream historical fact: frontier desserts were often basic but satisfying. Cornmeal cakes, molasses cookies, fried pastries, and puddings made with whatever sweeteners were available. Sugar was a precious commodity, sometimes traded, sometimes rationed, and sometimes substituted with molasses, honey, or even maple syrup when accessible. You take a piece of cornmeal cake, warm and slightly crumbly, and bite into it. The texture is firm but tender, the flavor gently sweet with a hint of butter, and it melts slowly on your tongue, comforting in its simplicity. Nearby, a tray of fried pies catches your eye. These small, handheld treats were filled with fruits like apples, cherries, or berries. You pick one up, feeling the warmth through the slightly crisp dough. The filling is soft, sweet, and a little tart, the pastry golden and flaky. A quirky tidbit emerges. Some frontier cooks experimented with savory fillings in fried pies, meat, cheese, or even beans, to stretch ingredients or cater to unexpected tastes. You smile at the thought, imagining a cowhand biting into a cherry and bacon hybrid, eyebrows raised in surprise, but perhaps secretly delighted. A bowl of rice pudding sits quietly on a corner shelf. Creamy, gently sweetened, and often spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, it's a dessert that required patience. Frontier cooks needed a long simmering pot and careful attention to avoid scorching. You take a spoonful, letting it coat your tongue. The warmth spreads through you, gentle and soothing, the soft texture comforting like a lullaby in edible form. Historians still argue whether rice pudding was primarily a celebratory dish or a more common indulgence, But you decide it doesn't really matter tonight. Its quiet sweetness is enough. Molasses cookies sit in a simple tin, their aroma rich and inviting. You nibble one slowly, letting the dark, caramel-like flavor linger. The texture is soft, with just a hint of chewiness, a satisfying counterpoint to the crisp fried pastries and crumbly cakes. Some frontier families would add ginger or cloves, giving these humble cookies a gentle warmth that deepened their character. You take another bite, noting how small variations could transform a simple treat into a memorable experience. A quirky little jar catches your eye: crystallized ginger. Apparently, some cooks offered it as a palate cleanser or a tiny pick-me-up after a long day of eating. You pop a piece into your mouth and are met with a spicy sweet punch that wakes the senses just enough to make you sit up straighter, if only briefly. It's surprising, unusual, and yet oddly fitting among the simpler desserts. You drift toward a small dish of candied nuts, the sugary coating glinting in the lantern light. They're crunchy, sweet, and comforting, a perfect combination after heavier meals or even just as a little indulgence alongside a cup of warm coffee. Frontier cooks were resourceful, sometimes adding spices like cinnamon or allspice, making these small treats more than just sugar. They were tiny sparks of joy in a dusty world. Historians still argue whether sweets like these were everyday indulgences or reserved for special occasions. From your slow, thoughtful exploration, you realize they could be both, depending on the generosity of the cook and the availability of ingredients. The desserts are more than food. They're a gentle punctuation, a whisper of luxury, a soft ending to the daily grind. You lean back slightly, feeling the weight of your meal and the gentle warmth that comes from a day, however imagined, well fed. The combination of cornbread, roasted meats, pickled vegetables, savory side dishes, beverages, and desserts has created a full, satisfying narrative of frontier culinary life. You notice how each flavor, texture, and aroma connects seamlessly with the next, a tapestry woven from necessity, creativity, and subtle indulgence. Now, in this quiet saloon corner, the world outside seems distant. The night is soft, the lanterns flicker lazily, and you can feel a slow, steady contentment spreading through your body. The desserts, the warm beverages, the comforting sides, they linger like a gentle melody, easing your thoughts, softening the edges of the day, and encouraging the slow descent into relaxation. You take one last bite of molasses cookie, allowing it to melt slowly in your mouth, savoring the faint spices and richness. You sip the remnants of your coffee, letting the warmth settle deeply in your chest. Your breathing slows, shoulders relax, and your mind drifts, gently tethered to the comforting rhythm of the frontier night. A small sigh escapes your lips as you allow the evening to fold over you like a soft quilt. Everything from roasted corn and jerky to pickled vegetables, spices, and desserts has carried you gently through the layers of the Wild West culinary experience. You feel nourished, soothed, and quietly satisfied, not just in body, but in the comforting cadence of simple, carefully prepared food. The saloon's lanterns flicker one last time, shadows stretching longer, the room settling into a calm hush. You can feel the steady pulse of the frontier town winding down, each creak, clink, and murmur blending into a gentle lullaby. And now, as the night fully embraces the town, you allow yourself to linger in the warmth, to sink into the softness of memory and imagination, letting the quiet satisfaction of a meal long savored carry you into gentle sleep. The room softens around you, the sounds fading into a gentle murmur, like a slow river moving under the moonlight. You feel the weight of your body on the chair or floor, the warmth in your chest from food, drink, and quiet reflection spreading evenly, comforting every limb. Every flavor, every scent, every tiny texture you've encountered tonight now drifts like a soft cloud through your senses, blending into a calm, steady rhythm. The roasted corn, the beans, the pickled vegetables, the savory sides, and finally the desserts, all linger gently, familiar and reassuring. Every flavor, every scent, every tiny texture you've encountered tonight now drifts like a soft cloud through your senses, blending into a calm, steady rhythm. You breathe slowly, letting the patterns of the frontier evenings settle in your mind. Imagine the quiet streets, the soft glow of lanterns, the murmur of conversation and laughter, the occasional distant hoofbeat fading into night. The world outside the saloon seems far away, and in this cocoon of warmth, food, and gentle human presence, there is nothing to do but relax. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, your shoulders drop, and your thoughts drift softly, tethered only to the comforting cadence of the evening. Let your mind rest on small, simple joys. A perfectly roasted ear of corn, the gentle tang of pickled cucumbers, the soft sweetness of molasses cookie melting in your mouth. Feel the warmth of coffee and whiskey, the slow satisfaction of a full meal, the subtle, grounding presence of spices and condiments that whispered stories of care and creativity. Imagine these flavors gently wrapping around you like a quilt, soothing and calm, a final comfort before sleep. And now, as your breathing slows and the night fully envelops the town and yourself, allow the gentle rhythm of the frontier evening, the lingering warmth of each bite, and the subtle hum of distant conversation to carry you softly, effortlessly, into a deep, quiet slumber. End of script. Sweet dreams.